It's 2030, and I want to tell you about a student named James. James scored a 170 on the LSAT in 2025. That score got applicants like him into schools ranked in the 30s with a full scholarship. He could have graduated debt-free, could have started his career owing nothing. But 5 years later, a 170 at those same law schools doesn't qualify for a single dollar of scholarship money. Not reduced scholarship, but zero. It's the same test, the same score, the same schools. The only thing that changed was the number everyone else was reporting. And that number went up, not because people got smarter, but because the system made it almost impossible for scores to go anywhere but up. James didn't get worse, but the treadmill got faster. My name is Steve Schwartz. I run LSAT Unplugged. And what happened to James is happening to you right now. What I'm about to walk you through is a scenario, not a prediction. Think of it as a stress test written from the future. Every force I describe is already in motion in 2026. I'm going to play it forward to show you what happens when the numbers on the LSAT stop meaning what everyone thinks they mean. We're going to stay in 2030 for most of this video, and I'll tell you when we come back to the present. Here is what crushed James. The LSAT score inflation that ate James's scholarship money wasn't caused by students getting smarter. It was caused by three forces that pushed reported LSAT scores upward without any corresponding improvement in actual legal reasoning ability. I'm going to walk you through each one. The first is the engine itself. The other two are the accelerants. The engine is retakes and the highest score rule. This is the structural force that made LSAT score inflation inevitable, even if the other two forces didn't exist. LSAC allows you to take the LSAT 5 times in any 5-year window and 7 times in a lifetime. That is generous enough that multiple retakes have become the norm rather than the exception. And here's the number that tells the whole story. Over the period of 2006 to 2013, 71% of LSAT takers were first-timers. By the 2018 to 2023 window, that number had dropped to 56%. And in the 2022 to 2023 testing year alone, only 51.7% of test takers were sitting for the first time. That means nearly half the people taking the LSAT had already taken it before. That shift happened in less than a decade, and it matters because of one rule. Law schools only report the highest LSAT score on your report to the American Bar Association, not the average, not the most recent, the highest score on your record. Think about what that means statistically. Every sitting of the LSAT involves some degree of variance. You might sleep poorly. You might get a section that plays more to your strengths. You might hit a flow state that you just can't explain. Any given score is your true ability plus or minus a few points of noise. Now, when you take the test only once, the noise averages out across the population. Some people have a good day, some have a bad day, and the distribution reflects your actual ability reasonably well. But when you take it 4 or 5 times and report only the best attempt, law schools are no longer reporting your ability. They're reporting your ability plus your luckiest day. And when nearly half the applicant pool is doing the same thing, the entire reported score distribution shifts up because the system selects for the high water mark. Now, LSAC's own data shows that second-time test takers score an average of 2.6 points higher than their first attempt. Of course, that's just the average. Some gain more. And a 2.5-point shift across tens of thousands of repeat test takers is enough to mechanically push school medians upward, even if nobody actually improved their reasoning ability. Now, James took the LSAT 4 times. His scores were 159, 164, 160, and then 164 again. His average was around a 162, but schools took into consideration the highest score, the 164. Now, that 164 was real. In fact, it happened twice, but that was the top of the range, not the average. It overstated what he'd do on any given day by about 2 points. Now, 2 points might not sound like much, but if you multiply James by tens of thousands of applicants, each reporting their personal best instead of their actual average, which is more close to their real ability, the aggregate median at every receiving school goes up mechanically because the reporting rules have essentially inflated the numbers. Now, of course, this was predictable, and in fact, it was predicted. But the Law School Admission Council had no financial incentive to change it, and I'll get to why in a moment. But first, let's talk about the accelerants. The one that nobody will talk about is the accommodations explosion. Now, there are students who genuinely need extended time on the LSAT, and this is not about them. But this is about what happens when a system creates a massive financial incentive and removes every incentive for checking whether that incentive is being used as intended. The LSAT is by design a time-pressured test. That is a bug, that is a feature, not a bug. The test measures not just whether you can reason through complex material, but whether you can do it under constraint. It's speed and accuracy put together, and that is, of course, what law school exams demand as well, along with the legal profession. The time pressure is part of what the score means. Now, extended time changes the fundamental nature of the exam. 50% more time doesn't give you 50% more of the same experience. It gives you a qualitatively different test, a test where time pressure is functionally eliminated. Questions that standard time takers have to triage and guess on, accommodated takers can work through more carefully. Passages that must be skimmed strategically can now be read in full. So the ceiling opens up in ways the score does not reflect. Now, here are the actual numbers, and they tell a story that accelerates, and this is from LSAC themselves. In the testing year 2012 to 2013, LSAC approved 729 accommodation requests. By 2016 to 2017, only 4 years later, that number had quadrupled to 3,000. But the real explosion came next. By 2018 to 2019, only 2 years after that, roughly 6,000 time accommodation requests were being granted per year. And only 4 years later, 2022 to 2023, we were up to 15,000, and LSAC was approving roughly 98% of all requests it received. So we've gone from 729 to 15,000 per year. And ADHD-related diagnoses made up the largest share, about 37% of all requests. Now, here's the data that should make you sit up and take pause, because this again comes from LSAC's own research. Test takers with extended time scored higher than the non-accommodated group in 18 out of 20 test administration studied. The average advantage was 4 to 5 points. And test takers who switched from standard time to accommodated testing, people who had previously taken the LSAT without extra time and then got it later, showed what LSAT described as, quote, very high score gains on average. 4 to 5 points, that is not marginal, that is an entire scholarship tier. That's the difference between paying full tuition and getting a full ride at dozens of schools. Now, the pipeline for getting accommodations had become an open secret in affluent pre-law circles. You find a neuropsychologist or a psychiatrist, ideally one who's known for being sympathetic to accommodation requests. You pay $2,000 to $5,000 for a comprehensive evaluation. You get a diagnosis, submit the documentation to LSAC. With a 98% approval rate, the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor, to say the least. And then the score goes on the report with no flag, no notation, no asterisk. LSAC removed the accommodations indicator from score reports several years ago. A 170 with standard time and a 170 with time and a half look identical on every single document the school will see. Schools could not tell the difference. They weren't even allowed to ask. Now, the students who knew about this, who had advisors, parents, pre-law networks that discussed this openly, they treat it as a strategic investment. $3,000 for an evaluation that could produce a score increase worth tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money, the return dwarfed anything else a student could do. And unlike blatant cheating, it was entirely legal. Everyone else competed at standard time against a score pool increasingly populated by people who'd taken a fundamentally different exam and never knew why the numbers kept pulling away from them. Then there was the accelerant that nobody could stop: cheating. When the LSAT went digital, the cheating market exploded. And I don't mean students glancing at a neighbor's screen. I mean organized commercial operations with real money behind them. By 2025, the problem had become public. LSAC suspended online LSAT testing in mainland China in August of 2025 after discovering what it called increasingly aggressive organized cheating services. A Chinese law student in the US had blown the whistle after seeing cheating services advertised openly on Chinese social media platforms like RedNote. Some operations charged up to $8,000 and offered what amounted to a guarantee. And these were real LSAT questions still in active use, questions that only LSAC should have had access to. Now, test content showed up in overseas forums within hours of the administration. Prep companies in certain markets had obtained live questions still being used and drilled their students on material they would see on test day. Proxy test takers, people paid to sit the exam under someone else's name, used remote desktop software or showed up in testing centers with fake IDs. LSAC had security measures. Remote proctoring with AI-powered monitoring software, required 360-degree room scans before the exam, algorithms to flag anomalous score jumps, score review committees. They pursued cases. They canceled results when the evidence was overwhelming. A student who jumps from a 149 to a 174 in 6 weeks is going to trigger an investigation. But the sophisticated cheaters didn't make it obvious. A proxy who scored a natural 172, pretending to be somebody else whose real ability was a 160, produced a score that looked like a good test day, not a red flag. The detection tools were calibrated for dramatic jumps, but moderate, plausible inflation flew under the radar. And the remote testing environment, which 40% of test takers were using, was structurally harder to secure. LSAC acknowledged as much. Remote test takers accounted for a majority of score holds. By February 2026, LSAC announced it would end remote testing entirely starting in August of 2026. So that tells you everything about how well security measures were working or not working. And the economics made enforcement a losing battle even beyond the remote format. A 6-point score increase could mean the difference between paying full tuition and getting a full ride, potentially $200,000 riding on a single test. At those stakes, the cheating industry could afford to innovate faster than a nonprofit testing organization could detect. And it didn't need to be widespread. Even a small percentage of fraudulent high scores concentrated at the top of the distribution, where every point affects school medians, was enough to push those medians upward. And once the medians moved, every honest test taker needed a higher score just to stay where they were. The cheaters didn't just cheat for themselves, they raised the curve for everyone. Now, while scores were inflating from below, AI destroyed the credibility of everything else in the application from above. In 2025 and 2026, admissions officers noticed a shift. Personal statements were getting better, uniformly, suspiciously better. The proportion of essays with awkward transitions, clunky phrasing, or structural problems dropped sharply. And at first, some officers took it as a positive sign. But then they realized the essays weren't better because the applicants were better writers. The essays were better because the applicants weren't writing them at all. By 2027, the problem was undeniable. Schools tried AI detection tools, but they were unreliable and full of false positives, and they were behind every model release. And they added requirements where you would have to certify it was your own work, but that functioned like an honor system in a high-stakes competition, meaning it didn't really function at all. Some tried out supervised writing samples, but the logistics were unworkable for schools processing thousands of applications, and the legal questions around accessibility were unsolvable as well. Now, the admissions officers I spoke with described a specific kind of frustration. They could feel that the essays were AI generated, but they couldn't really prove it, and they couldn't act on a feeling. And so they read thousands of polished, technically proficient, but soulless personal statements and learned nothing about the people who submitted them. And so by 2028, several schools had dropped the personal statement requirement entirely. Others kept it as a kind of formality. Then they dropped the diversity statements and then the addenda, then the Why Our School essays one by one. Every qualitative tool that let a human being show who they were behind the numbers became noise. And so what was left? Two numbers, just your LSAT score and your GPA. But here's the thing about GPAs that most applicants don't realize. That's inflating also. For the entering class of 2024, 135 out of roughly 200 ABA accredited law schools reported an increase in their median GPA. As of 2021, the median GPA among the top 20 law schools was already a 386, and it's continued climbing ever since. Undergraduate grade inflation has been accelerating for years. An A- is now the new B+, and law school medians reflect that compression as well. When everyone's GPA is a 3.7 or higher, the GPA stops differentiating anybody. So both numbers in the application were inflating, GPA and LSAT, but only one of them was still movable. Your GPA is fixed by the time you apply. You can't really go back and retake organic chemistry. So that made the LSAT the single variable in the entire admissions process that a student could still control. It was the one number that schools could still trust as a genuine signal. It was the one factor carrying the weight of every qualitative element that AI had destroyed and every GPA point that grade inflation had compressed. The LSAT didn't just get more important, it absorbed the evaluative function of the entire rest of the application. In 2020, your LSAT score was the most important part of your application. But by 2028, it essentially was your application. And that was happening at the exact moment the score was being inflated by forces that had nothing to do with the skills the test was designed to measure. Now here's where the arms race closed its jaws. When scores inflate across the board, school medians rise. When schools medians rise, the score you need for the same outcome at the same school goes up. It's just pure math. And here's how fast the math was moving. For the entering class of 2024, 135 law schools reported an increase in their median GPA. Aggregate median LSAT scores rose as well, with dozens of schools hitting all-time highs in both median LSAT and median GPA simultaneously. And this was before the full compounding of retakes, the accommodations wave, and the cheating crisis. US News ranks schools partially on their median LSAT scores. And when your peer school's medians climb, yours has to climb or you fall in the rankings. It's a zero-sum contest. If you fall in the rankings, you lose applicants next cycle. If you lose applicants, you lose tuition revenue. No school can unilaterally opt out. If you reported average scores instead of your highest scores, that would tank your median relative to every peer keeping the old rules. And so every school chased the inflated medians. Every single one, even the ones that privately knew the numbers were empty. The only currency schools had to chase those medians was scholarship money, because every other law school was doing the exact same thing. A 170 that drew a half scholarship 5 years earlier now commanded a full ride because 6 peer schools were offering the same thing. That money had to come from somewhere. It came from the middle. And so here's how it worked at James's target school. In 2025, the scholarship matrix looked roughly like this. Students with 3 to 4 points above the median, around a 163 at the time, got near full rides. Students at or just above the median got significant offers, and students below paid closer to sticker price because they didn't help the school's profile, and the schools needed their tuition to fund scholarships for the students who did. By 2028, the median had climbed to 167, and the entire matrix shifted with it. The full ride line moved from 167 to 171. The significant scholarship line moved from 163 to 167. And a 164 went from being a point above the old full ride threshold to 3 points below the new median. That meant the money that would have been the 164 student scholarship was now going to students with 171s. And some of those 171s were earned. Some were the product of 5 retakes in a lucky day. Some were achieved with time and a half that nobody would ever know about. Some were just bought outright, and it didn't matter. The score report looked the same for all of them, and the school needed those numbers. So James applied, got in, and got a tuition bill that was $147,000 more than it would have been 3 years earlier. Same school, but different speed. Now, I want to talk about something that the data doesn't capture. Because if you're studying for the LSAT right now, you're living inside the same arms race, and it doesn't feel like a structural analysis, it feels like you're drowning. It's the Reddit threads at 2 a.m. Somebody posts a 172 score report, and the comments are a mix of congratulations and despair. You're comparing your practice scores to somebody else's reported peaks, and you don't realize those peaks are the top of a 5-attempt range. You think everybody around you's gotten smarter, but they're not. They're just reporting their highest score while you're looking at your lowest. And so it's the shame spiral after a retake that doesn't move. You studied for 3 more months, you took the test again, you scored 1 point higher, or maybe the same or lower, and now you're doing the math on whether to sign up for a 4th time, knowing that you're spending another $250 and another 3 years of your life, 3 months of your life, not 3 years, and you can't tell if you're investing or you're just feeding the machine. You're watching medians climb while you're still studying. You had a plan, you were targeting a school with a median of a 163, but then you checked the 509 data, and it's now a 165, then 166. The target is moving while you're still aiming, and nobody explains why. Nobody tells you that the curve is being pushed by retake reporting rules, by accommodations, by cheating, so you assume that you're the problem, that everybody else is better than you. You're assuming that the 170 scorers are people who just studied harder, and of course some of them did, but a lot of them didn't. That experience is part of how the LSAT arms race perpetuates itself, driving more retakes, which feeds the inflation, which feeds the despair. It all runs on your anxiety. Now Maya almost got swallowed by it, and her story is the way out. Of course, score inflation didn't just distort admissions, it followed students into the classroom and exposed them. Now here's a consequence that nobody was talking about in real time, and it might be the most important part of the entire story. When a significant portion of incoming students carry scores that overstate their reasoning abilities, whether from retakes, accommodations, or cheating, those students arrive at law school with a gap between what their number promised and what they can actually do. Law school doesn't care about your highest LSAT score. The Socratic method doesn't give you time and a half. Your contracts exam isn't graded on a best of 5 basis. From day 1 of 1L, you're performing once, under pressure in real time, and the skills your score was supposed to represent are the skills you need immediately. By 2028, professors at mid-ranked schools were reporting a pattern they had never seen before. Incoming classes had the highest LSAT medians than beyond any previous cohort. On paper, they were the strongest students ever. But their performance on 1L exams didn't match. The gap between entering credentials and actual academic results was wider than it had ever been. Now, some students were fine. The ones whose scores reflected genuine preparation performed exactly the way their numbers predicted. But a visible chunk of each class was struggling in ways that a 168 score shouldn't really be struggling. The reasoning ability wasn't there. The analytical speed wasn't there. The ability to break apart a complex argument under time pressure, the thing that LSAT was literally designed to measure, wasn't there either. And the students themselves were often the most confused. They had been told by their score, by their admission, by their scholarship offer, that they belonged exactly where they were. And they did belong, but their score did not belong. And so the downstream effects cascaded. Curved grading meant that inflated LSAT scores, pulling down the middle of the class, displaced students whose scores were lower, but real. Academic support offices were overwhelmed by students who on paper shouldn't have needed support. Bar exam prep programs that calibrated their assumptions to incoming LSAT medians found those assumptions were wrong. And then the bar exam results came in. Schools whose LSAT medians had climbed 3 or 4 points saw bar passage rates hold flat or slip. The scores went up, but the outcomes didn't follow. That is the single clearest proof that the score inflation was hollow. If the higher LSAT scores had represented real ability gains, bar passage would have risen with them, but it did not. Now, here is the most damning piece of data in this entire story, from LSAC's own predictive validity research. LSAT scores obtained with extended time overpredict law school performance. That means a student who scores a 168 with time and a half performs in law school like a standard time student who scores lower. The score overpromises, and the gap shows up in law school grades, bar passage rates, and career outcomes, and LSAC has known this for years. They've published the data, but they have not changed their accommodations policy. And then it connects to the job market too. Hiring partners at law firms are not naive. When they noticed that associates from schools with rising LSAT medians weren't performing better, and in some cases were performing worse relative to expectations, they shifted weight to law school GPA. The LSAT score got you in, but your law school grades determined whether you got higher, which means the classroom crack didn't just affect your experience at school, it determined your career. The chain of collapse went like this. AI killed the application essay, so schools leaned harder on the LSAT. But inflation hollowed out the LSAT. Law schools then started leaning harder on their own grades. And at every link in that chain, the students with genuine reasoning ability came out ahead because genuine ability was the only signal that survived every stage of the process. That's the world you walk into if your LSAT score is a number you reached rather than a skill you built. The score gets you through the door. But behind the door, nobody cares about your peak, they care about your baseline. Now, let me tell you about someone who made sure there was no gap. Maya had roughly the same starting point as James, similar GPA, and a similar diagnostic score on her first LSAT attempt, 157. 7 points below the median at the schools she wanted to attend. In an inflated market, the gap between where she was and where she needed to be was more like 11 or 12 points. She almost didn't even try. She told me later that when she saw the 157, she did the math on what the medians were doing and felt the doors closing. She'd been reading forums, she'd seen the score reports people were posting, 168, 170, 172. She didn't know those numbers were being reported after 4 or 5 retakes and reported ceilings. She didn't know about accommodations. She didn't understand that the curve she was comparing herself to was artificially inflated. All she knew was that her 157 LSAT looked pathetic next to the numbers everybody else seemed to be hitting. She was deep in that psychological spiral I just described, the comparison trap, the assumption that everybody else was doing better. She almost took the LSAT cold just to get a real score and see where I stand. That's the treadmill talking. That's the system pulling you onto the track before you've built anything. Now her coach, someone who'd been watching the arms race build for years and understood what the medians were actually doing, told her no, don't take it yet, build first, the score will come later. And she didn't like hearing that because she wanted to know her number, and everybody does. There is a gravitational pull toward taking the LSAT before you're ready. Partly because LSAT retake culture normalizes it, partly because the anxiety of not knowing feels worse than the reality of a low score. Her coach told her that a premature attempt would become an anchor both psychologically and strategically. You don't walk into a final exam after 2 weeks of class and expect to set the curve. You do the work first, then you perform. So she did the work. She studied argument structure until she could break apart an argument in seconds without consciously thinking about the process. She drilled conditional logic until contrapositives were automatic. She did full-time sections under strict conditions every single week because she understood that the pressure was part of what the score needed to mean. She practiced the hardest question types until they were familiar terrain, and she worked with a coach who could see what she couldn't, the patterns in her mistakes, the reasoning gaps she taught herself to work around instead of actually fix, the 2 or 3 foundational weaknesses that were capping her score without her realizing it. And it took 5 months. 5 months of focused, structured, coached preparation. The kind where you're worse on Wednesday than you were on Monday because you're tearing down a bad habit and rebuilding it correctly. The kind that feels like regression before it becomes a leap. Her first real LSAT was a 169. The second was a 171. Both scores were within the range of her actual ability. Wasn't a lucky day. Her practice test average for the month before each attempt was within 2 points of the real thing, so the official score only confirmed what the preparation had built. And that 171 in an inflated market was a different kind of asset than the same score 5 years earlier. Law schools needed high scores to protect their medians more desperately than ever before. So Maya wasn't just a student they wanted, she was a number they needed. And unlike a lot of the 171s in the applicant pool that year, hers was backed by actual reasoning ability. She negotiated a full scholarship at a school where that deal would have required a 167 in 2025. The inflation raised the price of entry, but it also raised the premium schools would pay for a high score, and Maya's preparation had outpaced the inflation. And so when she called her parents to tell them she was going to law school for free, her mom cried. She was a first-generation college student, no family money, no pre-law network. Nobody in her life had gone through this process before. She told me later that the phone call was the first moment it felt real. Not the offer letter, not the negotiation, but hearing her mom's voice break and realizing she'd built something nobody in her family ever had. And in law school, there was no gap as far as she was concerned. Her 1L section included students with scores of 168, 169, 170. On paper, they were her peers. But in the classroom, using the Socratic method, the differences surfaced within weeks. There was a moment in her contracts class where a professor posed a question about consideration doctrine that had stumped the room. The fact pattern was complex, multi-layered, with a subtle flaw in the reasoning that made the obvious answer wrong. And Maya saw it because the structure of the flaw was identical to a logical reasoning pattern she had drilled during her LSAT prep. A sufficient condition being treated as a necessary condition. The LSAT had trained her to spot that exact kind of error, and that skill transferred directly to legal analysis. So she raised her hand, dissected the flaw in real time, while students with higher reported LSAT scores sat silent. And that is not a coincidence. That is what genuine LSAT preparation produces. It doesn't just get you a score, it builds the analytical infrastructure you use every day in law school. The students whose scores reflected real ability had that infrastructure. The students whose scores were artifacts of the inflation were trying to build it on the fly against the clock. And so Maya graduated near the top of her class. No debt, and 3 job offers by September of her 3L year. Now, James, our other student, graduated too. He finished in the middle of his class, solid, competent, but indistinguishable from 30 other associates applying to the same jobs in the same market. He's practicing at a mid-sized firm, makes $78,000 a year, owes $147,000. Every month, he writes a check for $1,400 on a degree that 3 years earlier would have cost him nothing. And he'll be writing that check well into his 40s. Now, here's the part that stays with me. James went to a bar association event in the fall of 2030. One of those receptions with lukewarm wine and too many name tags, he started talking to another attorney, a woman about his age, similar score, similar practice area, and so they compared notes. They asked, where did you go? When did you graduate? What's your LSAT? 164 is what she said, same as his. Now, she got a full scholarship. He asked her to say it again. He couldn't believe it. She got a full ride. She wasn't smarter than him or more accomplished, didn't negotiate harder or write a better personal statement. But she had applied before the arms race moved the line past his number. That was the entire difference. So he stood there doing the math in his head. $1,400 a month in debt for 15 years with the same degree, the same school, same LSAT score. But she paid nothing. He was going to pay $147,000. Now, he could not sleep that night. He wasn't angry, but he finally understood what had happened. The system moved, but he didn't, and nobody had told him while it was happening that the LSAT medians were inflating, or that his score was being devalued in real time by retakes, by accommodations gaming, by organized cheating. Nobody told him that the full scholarship sitting on the table 3 years earlier had been swept away by forces he had never been asked to understand. That was the price of not knowing. Now, a student at a Manhattan prep school hears about the accommodations pipeline from a college counselor junior year of high school. The parents pay for the evaluation. without thinking about it. So by the time they take the LSAT, they've had extra time on every standardized test from 10th grade through to law school applications. In contrast, a first-gen student at a state school has never even heard of accommodations, doesn't know they exist, doesn't know it's an option, takes the LSAT with standard time, first try, 3 months of self-studying and a used prep book. That's it. They're taking the same test, but they are not playing the same game. Score inflation hits hardest at those with the fewest resources. The cheating networks cost money, could be up to $8,000. Accommodations pipeline costs you $2,000 to $5,000 for just the evaluation alone, plus the knowledge that the option even exists. Taking the LSAT multiple times requires multiple $250 registration fees, plus the time to spend months studying instead of working and making money. Now, every one of the LSAT score inflation forces is more accessible to those with money, connections, and time. Those who do not have the advantages compete honestly and then get measured against a curve that's been pushed upward by people playing a different game. Maya was a first-gen student. She did not even know about accommodations until she'd already started preparing, and she couldn't afford 5 retakes. Didn't have a network of advisors whispering about the edges. What she had was a coach who told her the truth about what she was up against and helped her build a score that was real. Most students don't have that. They see the medians climbing, they see scholarship lines moving, but they don't understand why their score suddenly isn't enough. But it's the system that's the problem, not them. LSAC charges approximately $250 per LSAT sitting. And so a student who takes the LSAT 5 times has paid over $1,200 in test fees alone. And the credential assembly service is another couple hundred. Your score reports, $45 per school. So across 12 schools, we're talking about over $500. And then before you've even spent $1 on test prep itself, just applying costs you nearly $2,000. And that's for somebody who only takes the test once. Now, add what students actually spend to compete. Prep courses, couple $1,000. Serious coaching, maybe more. Study materials, practice tests, diagnostic tools, plus your time. Every time you retake the LSAT, it's another month or 2 of studying. If you retake it 3 times, you've lost the better part of a year. So the total cost of this entire process, fees, test prep, opportunity costs, thousands and thousands of dollars. It gets you the one highest score on your record that may or may not reflect your actual ability, and it contributes one more inflated data point to the system that will force next year's applicants to run even harder. Every retake feeds this machine. LSAT collects the fees. The highest score rule encourages another retake. The inflated LSAT scores raise the medians. The higher medians send more students back for another sitting, and LSAC collects again. Now, of course, I'm not saying LSAC designed this deliberately as a revenue strategy, but the revenue model is structurally aligned with score inflation. Every force pushing scores up also pushes their test volume up. And the policy changes that would slow that inflation, reducing permitted retakes, reporting all scores to schools, all scores being considered, flagging accommodated sittings, that would all reduce that volume. Not saying they should do this, but that would be the consequence. Now, other testing organizations have also faced this. The SAT was completely recentered in 1995 because score inflation had compressed the top of the scale to the point where it could no longer differentiate students. The College Board acknowledged the problem and rebuilt the system from the ground up. The MCAT was redesigned in 2015, partly because retakes in prep had eroded the score's predictive value. LSAC did take one major step. They're ending remote testing in August 2026 to address the worst cheating vulnerabilities. But the retake policy is the same. The highest score reporting rule is the same. Accommodations policy is the same. So the structural engine of inflation is still running. The students who can least afford it are the ones running the hardest. And LSAC profits from every lap of the race. Now, that was 2030. But of course, you're not watching this in 2030, you're watching this right now. The LSAT median at the school you're targeting is higher than it was a couple of years ago. And you can check this yourself in the ABA 509 reports. Find your target school, look at the entering class median for, say, 2020, then look at 2025. Look at the difference. That's how fast the treadmill is moving under your feet. Now, here is one more thing to consider. If LSAC does eventually change the rules further, like limiting retakes more, if the ABA requires schools to report all scores and average them, the retake machine would fall apart overnight. The students who built genuine ability wouldn't lose that much. Their scores are real. And preparing for real isn't just the best strategy in the current system, it's the only one that survives every version of the system. Now, if you already have a score from a couple years ago and your number felt competitive back then, go look at the LSAT medians today. The requirements have changed. They've changed to get in. They've changed to get you scholarship money as well. So the question is, what do you do about all this, right? Now, here's what works. Genuine, structured preparation that builds real reasoning ability. The kind that produces a score you can reproduce under pressure every time you sit down. Not a lucky day, but a baseline that is above the inflated line. That is the only thing the arms race cannot erode. Cheating inflates the curve, but your real ability stays. Accommodations might shift the distribution, but your actual reasoning ability stays. Retake culture pushes reported scores up, but your baseline is going to hold. When you get to law school, there is no inflation to hide behind. Every exam, every cold call, every brief, test the real thing. When law firms look at your law school GPA, they're seeing the signal that survived every filter. And if LSAC does eventually change the rules, and the pressure to do so is building, the students with genuine ability are the only ones left standing. The students who build skills for real, who invest in coach preparation that targets their actual weaknesses, who train under timed conditions because they understand that time pressure is part of the skill, who treat the LSAT as a reasoning system to master rather than a number to reach, those students are insulated from everything I just described. The inflation becomes somebody else's problem. The score means what it says. That is the investment. Now, every retake without a real plan is essentially a donation to LSAC and a contribution to the inflation that's working against you. You're paying $250 to generate another data point that pushes the curve up, which raises the median at your target school, which pushes scholarships further away, which sends you back to take it again. 5 more attempts, $1,200 in fees, close to a year of your life. And at the end, the highest score might be 3 to 4 points above your actual ability, which is a gap that law school will expose before 1L's first semester ends. Now, if you'd like my help building the real thing, the reasoning ability that produces a score that inflation cannot touch, that is exactly what I do. I'm offering free LSAT tutoring to everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below this video on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. If you found this helpful, I do lives like this every single weekday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you're watching this. I'll see you all Monday. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for joining.